And we're live on Facebook. Welcome everybody to our Facebook audience. I'll apologize real briefly that my voice is not as great as it would like to be, as I would like it to be, but welcome, and a special welcome this evening when there are a lot of other things going on, certainly in the city of Charleston. We have protests and vigils being conducted for passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and certainly in the wake of the Breonna Taylor decision, which we're all going to be very mindful of, certainly now, but also in the future. But I'm really glad that you're here because tonight's topic in our Restorative Justice Forum series is an extremely important one, and one that we really need to focus on more, certainly here locally in Charleston, Berkeley County, but all over the nation. And that is how we heal the harm of domestic violence. We're joined by three spectacular panelists. First, Sharon Stefan, who is a survivor, a speaker, and an advocate. You'll be hearing from her and about her experience. From Mackie Moore, who's the founder and CEO of Thrive Saves Lives, which is an organization right here in the Charleston area. It's an initiative to provide transitional housing services and holistic resources for survivors of domestic violence and their family pets, which is really important, and to educate folks about domestic violence and abuse issues, intimate partner violence, as well as eradicate violence against women and children in the state of South Carolina. And Mackie's also a documentary film producer, which is pretty cool. And we are really just absolutely floored and honored to have Dr. Rita Smith here. Dr. Smith, I should say, sorry about that, Rita, is the Senior Advisor to the NFL Domestic Violence Task Force and VP of External Relations at domesticshelters.org, former Executive Director at the NCADV, National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So just as a little bit of information about myself, I'm Ben Pogue. I'm a lawyer here in Charleston, South Carolina. I also happen to be a Democrat running for the Ninth Circuit Solicitor's Office. And just as an aside, we want to make sure that our audience knows that no participant or panelist's presence should be interpreted as an endorsement of this campaign or any others. That's really important. It's part of us providing safe spaces where people feel they have an ability to share and be heard in what their truth is, and accurately, with dignity and respect. But our topic this evening, as I mentioned, it's incredibly important. And this Justice Forum series is part of the process, we hope, of having an expanded discussion about what the justice issues are out there, what domestic violence and abuse solutions could be. And a lot of that has to do with the educational process and having people share their various voices and perspectives. So to get started with it, I wanted to start out with really the most basic question that I could think of. And that's what is each of our panelists' perspective and experience on domestic violence like? It can really be helpful in these discussions to sort of have a baseline. And I thought there would be no better person to talk about a survivor experience than Sharon Stefan. Sharon, would you mind sharing with us what your experience and perspective is?
Well, there's different versions of my perspective, but being in that situation and living in fear all the time, you're afraid to go to try to get help because you're afraid that he will find out, you're afraid that they won't do anything, and then you are stuck. I've been in situations where I decided that I was safest if I would go lock myself in my car at night while the kids slept. So I would go out around 10 o'clock. I would set the alarm for around 5 in the morning, and then I would go back in the house to get them up so the kids wouldn't know. I called family court and asked them if that would be considered abandonment, sleeping in my car. And instead of asking me what my name was and where I was and if I needed any help, the person just said, "Oh, yes, as long as you're in your driveway." And, nobody wants to get their hands dirty with the situation. I drove to a sheriff's department to see if they would do anything because I was afraid. And they said they didn't see any marks on me, so they couldn't do anything. And it just becomes frustrating to the point where people wonder why you stay or why you just don't go and do something. But it's because nothing can be done. and then you're still stuck, and they're mad, and they're going to do even worse things. And so it's the fear of the unknown, and knowing that you don't have any type of protection or anyone in your corner. There was nothing like Thrive. I didn't know Mackie. There was nothing. Even, churches don't like getting involved in that type of thing. They don't want to get involved in a messy divorce or anything that has to do with feathers getting ruffled in any way. He had also been, an elder at our church. So the people that had served certainly did not want to believe that. So they didn't want to get involved. So that's basically been my experience. It's just hitting a lot of walls until I met Mackie.
And that's a nice for Sharon. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's something that people sometimes don't know about. And Mackie, Sharon provided a nice lead in to you. So let me ask you, we hear Sharon's experience, we hear her truth. As somebody who's an advocate who works with a lot of folks who endure this kind of situation, what are the similarities to other stories that are out there? What are the ingredients that sometimes people don't know in terms of what domestic abuse entails?
First of all, I just want to thank Sharon because she is a survivor and she has the courage to tell her story and to help other women and children who are in a position similar to the one that she was in. And when survivors tell their stories and speak their truth, it's a lot easier for other women and subsequently children to talk about their experience because it's not so taboo. So it's very important that we make this conversation a priority in our communities because this will allow people to come forward without being so afraid that that they're not going to be heard or they're not going to be supported or they're going to tell their story and then they're going to get a double whammy for going outside of the home and discussing quote unquote their personal and private matters. South Carolina has been first in the nation and is always near the top of the states with the greatest number of women murdered by men per year at a rate of more than double the national average. That's been for the past 20 years since they've been keeping statistics on this. We've been first 5 times, always near the very top. And I get asked why. Why is South Carolina the way it is? And a few things that I'd like to share. We are still a good old boy state where almost everything is run by white privileged men. And yes, that's changing slowly, but as I've been on this crusade to change things in South Carolina, I have found it very difficult to get the support I need from people that are in office because it's a threat to white male privilege. Also, we're in the Bible Belt, and many people interpret, the Bible very literally, and they understand that the husband is the head of the household, that the wife must do what the husband says, that is the natural order of things. And often, like Sharon said, if somebody is faith-based in their beliefs, when they go to a pastor or other church members, often people don't want to hear it. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to get in the middle. They don't want to be responsible. They don't want to take sides. And it's so very isolating for the women. And I do talk mainly about women and children, because women are over 85% of the population who actually receives the abuse. Men, it's a much smaller percentage. And it's not that I don't feel for them, but women in especially in South Carolina have a really raw deal all the way around economically. The way that they aren't paid equally to men for the same job, their health care. It goes on, but women are literally second-class citizens in the state of South Carolina, and that's something that we're working very hard to change. And then last but not least, and there's so much more I could say, but you know, I just want everyone to know that domestic violence is not just happening in the hood or in underserved communities. I get just as many calls from south of Broad as I do from south of the tracks.
So in my neighborhood, where I was in, sleeping in my car in the driveway next to a $400,000 house.
Right. I mean, exactly. And so many people think, oh, well, this is a, a problem with minorities and with the underserved. Wrong. It is, but it's also just as much an issue in the middle class and the upper middle class. And often there's so much social pressure. And when your husband's a doctor or a lawyer, for example, and you have kids going to school, private school maybe, if you report the domestic violence and your husband is arrested, they can be disbarred. They can have their medical license revoked. Where is the money going to come from to support the family? What happens to your social circle, where the one that reports the abuse is often outcast when the one that is the abuser is often embraced? Because you know, nobody can believe that somebody like that would really commit a violent act. But the truth is, it's happening next door to you. It's happening across the street. It's happening down the street. It's happening everywhere. And just because you don't know it, this is an epidemic, but it's a silent epidemic. And so, you know, you walk into a restaurant and you see 4 women sitting at a table, chances are at least one of them is being abused. Wow. So when and maybe 2. The statistic is, you know, 1 in 4. I beg to differ from the phone calls I get. I'm sure, Rita, that you will probably agree with me there. I think the percentage is so much higher than 1 in 4.
And Mackie and Rita, it seems like we're talking about isolation. We're talking about a male-dominated and sort of society, and certainly a tipped playing field. Maybe Rita literally tipped when we're talking about a playing field in some of your experience. And we're talking about people who have an obstacle of what are the ramifications of what of maybe reporting, and reporting is such a huge issue. So Rita, with your very many really interesting and diverse areas of expertise and experience, what are the real ingredients that we need to have to pave the way for more reporting and for more action? What do those ingredients look like when we're up against all these different obstacles?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at different ways we can approach. And just point of clarification, I don't have my doctorate. Okay. I had fantasies once upon a time about it, and then I got in domestic violence work and never had a moment to further my career or my education beyond that. But women like Sharon were willing to share their truths with me, and so they have made me an expert, and I have doctorate level expertise in this issue, because people were willing to trust me with their truth. And if anyone ever shares their abuse with you, you should hold that like a fragile gift in your hands, because they are enormously vulnerable in making that truth known to you. And so don't treat it as if it's not something that you should be holding and responding to in an appropriate way. So there's lots of ways to do that. And the obstacles are huge. It's, you know, Mackie referred to some of them in terms of one of the things she's dealing with in terms of providing housing. Housing is an enormously costly experience for anybody. Everybody who's on this call and who's watching this knows that. Housing is an enormous expense. And if someone leaves, what the data shows is that women who get divorces generally end up, their income status usually drops by 30 or 40%, and the men generally actually have an increase in their income status. And so just walking away is a financial burden. The reality is that the first thing you know that a survivor is going to come up against is whether or not anybody actually believes them. If people don't believe them, then where are they going to go? What are they going to do? So I think the issue is that first you need to believe them, and then you need to understand that the next question might be, how can I help? Whatever's going on in your head about how you think you can help and what you want to do and what direction you want to take people, just stop. Don't do that. Just listen and then say, what can I do to help you? What do you need me to do to help you? Maybe it's finding a place to live. Maybe it's finding better childcare. Maybe it's helping them, excuse me, engage in the criminal or civil court systems. Not everybody will want to do that, but that's an option, and they should have that option. They need support for that option. And then maybe they have to change their workplace, because now that's not a safe place anymore. If they decide to leave, the abuser can find them and harass them on a regular basis when actually we're back working in locations.
What you just said about the housing real quick and the income thing, the one thing that popped in my head when you said that is that was one of the problems. I ended up being in the house 4 years longer than I needed to be, actually separated from him. But, you know, I was a stay-at-home mom for 11 years, and part of that, you know, really had to be because my son was sick for 4 years of chemo, and so I had to be home. So I had a bare bones resume going back to work. The median income here versus the housing isn't even close. And so just trying to find a place, and then of course you have to have a deposit and a first month's rent. And I didn't have, you know, a lot of work experience over 11 years as far as showing that I could make the income to afford the apartment. They're really strict on that. Trying to find somebody to co-sign for you. I mean, it was just all a mess. And that's another thing, is they're having to go out and possibly with somewhere that's not that safe, but might be a little safer than being with your husband. But again, here we have the process of we don't have any housing for them to go to, so they just stay there. That was my problem.
Yeah, and housing is a huge part of it. We don't have enough affordable housing here in South Carolina. And
nowhere.
I'm not sure if I'm right on the numbers, so please correct me, but I believe that for half of the women who end up homeless, the major reason that they do end up homeless is because of domestic violence and intimate partner violence.
Yeah, homeless and on substance like food stamps or subsidized housing, subsidized income. Many of them enter that system, what is derogatorily termed as a welfare system, but a safety net support system for people who need help. A significant number of them, it could be up to 85%, have experienced abuse in their life. So yes, it's an economic drain on all of us to not address these issues more effectively.
It sounds like we really are in need of much more holistic approaches, but it also seems like, especially Rita, when you talk about the vulnerability of any survivor in sharing this, it sounds like we need a whole lot more training, certainly of the folks who are in law enforcement, folks who are in solicitors' offices, public defenders' offices, but also as a society, we sort of need to elevate an understanding of what this issue is. And Mackie, I think that's something that also you've been working on, is having better guidance, especially for people who are in justice or in law enforcement, in terms of understanding how to react and then what the guidance really needs to be moving forward, especially in terms of training.
You know, and it's something that you and I have talked about a little bit, actually more than a little bit, but is that you and I have a common goal. We want to start a domestic violence court here, so that all domestic violence cases are heard in a court where everyone within the court system is trained properly, and they're educated on domestic violence and the dynamics and the issues that can arise, which I see all the time, where you're waiting to go into court, and they have the survivor sitting right next to the abuser, which is absolutely terrifying for anyone who has been abused. And also another thing that you and I have talked about, which I think is hugely important, is the establishment of a family justice center, so that if you are a victim, you have a one-stop shop all under one roof where you go to get help. So you have DSS there, you have legal aid there, you have domestic violence counseling, and so forth, so that everything you could possibly need is under one roof. And it makes it a lot easier for the survivor to get help and to get and it becomes more of a collaborative effort. And with the court, it's especially important because so many of the judges aren't trained in domestic violence and exactly what's going on and how the cases differ. And they still have very old beliefs about what's really going on. And I was trying to get a restraining order with a client, and she literally had a book thick full of evidence of this person stalking her after she broke up with him, and really backtracking to her entire life, calling her grade school friends and telling them how terrible she was. And this was, he was calling a different state. He was making so many problems for her. So we finally got to court. We presented the information, and the judge literally said, "Why should I give you a restraining order when you're just going to go back to him anyway?" And that is
really, it's egregious. I mean, and
horrible.
The vulnerability. I mean, for folks who have gone through these experiences, I literally can't imagine. But Rita, let me ask you about this, because Mackie brings up a tremendous point. Men in these situations who are big decision makers, and working with the NFL, you deal with a lot of men. And
Right.
one of the things you said is we need more men involved. What's the role in terms of maybe participating in training, in terms of being better decision makers, better participants and partners that men should be having in this process?
Well, I think, as I'm listening, there's, whether men are involved in an official stance, like within the system, or as a judge, or even as a faith leader, or whether it's a neighbor or a friend of the abuser. Men have a particularly important role to play in just setting a different standard, saying this is not acceptable behavior. This is not how you treat somebody you love. And you need to stop. You need to stop, brother, because this is wrong and you need to stop it. Men doing that as a peer, as an influencer, or as somebody in a government position who actually holds the power of consequences. I think it's really important that those messages come out. And the good news is that most men are not abusive. That's the good news. The bad news has always been, in the over 30 years I've done this, that too few of them are vocal. Most of them are just silent on this issue. We have to get men to be willing to say out loud, stop. Do not do this anymore. I cannot be your friend. I won't play pickup basketball with you. I'm not going to sit on the same pew at you at church. I need you to understand that this is bad behavior and it hurts all of us. So community safety is a real issue here because for people who don't know this, most of the mass murders in this country are domestic violence related. Over 50% of the mass murders in this country are domestic violence related. So none of us are safe if we're not setting a different standard here about how people need to treat each other.
Yeah, Rita,
And, I just wanted to make one point before it leaves my mind, Ben, when you put on the chat the no visible bruises, the book recommendation. I think it's really important for most people to understand that physical violence isn't even a significant part of some people's abusive experience, that coercive control is actually much more common, and everyone gets verbally abused. They get threatened, they get terrorized. There are lots of ways to try to control another human being without ever touching them. You can do that by lots of different kinds of tactics, whether it's monitoring every step they take, or it's if challenging them for every time they look at the man in the car next to you as you're sitting at a stoplight. I mean, there's lots of ways to control another human being, and it's not always physical violence. And some women never experience it much at all. So I think that, Sharon, you said you didn't have any bruises. They didn't see anything on you, so that's why the police didn't want to help you. You don't have to be hit to be hurt and in danger.
and
That was my point.
yeah, far too frequently we don't have training for detecting those bruises. And Rita, one of the things that was in No Visible Bruises, a great book, is the lack of training on strangulation.
Yeah,
and
it's a huge issue.
Legislation, where if unfortunately some of those signs that happen after a strangulation event, the deprivation of oxygen, they mimic other kinds of things that sometimes our police officers and Mackie, I know you're going to talk about this, there's a higher incidence of domestic abuse among police officers. Sometimes they don't have the right context, and they will go into a scene with having come from a station that is populated by a lot of other guys where there's some degree of tolerance maybe, and they don't see that this is somebody who looks lethargic. They see somebody who is, oh, that person is probably under the influence or something like that, not thinking that the lethargy could be a part of the strangulation recovery and symptomology. Mackie, I wanted to bring it back to you with a couple of things. Obviously, we're here in Charleston. Dylan Roof was somebody who witnessed a great deal of domestic abuse. Right. We know that other, like Rita was talking about, other mass killings, John or Lee Boyd Malvo, the Washington, D.C. area shootings, that was a domestic violence event.
Yep,
the nightclub down in Florida, that essentially was a remnant of a domestic violence event. But there are so many ramifications. It's like there are waves that spread out from these violent events. And Sharon and Mackie, if you guys could chime in on those kinds of ramifications of these situations.
This is a registry. It's sort of like the sex offender registry, but it's a domestic violence registry of men who have been habitual and been reported. So there's something to go on for employers, for people who want to hire, to get hired to work around women or kids or anything like that. I'd love to see some type of registry or something that the public can actually see and be easy to access, instead of having to kind of navigate their way through court records and things like that to find out these things about somebody. It would be nice to have a national registry of some kind that shows that they've been reported and they've been either arrested or they've been in some way involved in these violent behaviors.
A point that I would like to make is that in South Carolina, the average abused woman returns to her abuser an average of 9 times because of a lack of housing and resources. 9 times before she finally either escapes or she gets murdered, which in South Carolina happens every 7 days. So That's about the average. A woman is murdered by an intimate partner once every 7 days in South Carolina. Then if she reaches out for help and leaves, chances are that she's going to return to her abuser because she doesn't have enough money. The resources in South Carolina are nil. For our Tri-County area of over 750,000 people, we have 36 beds for emergencies. That doesn't even.
Wait, can you say that again? Because
Yes.
I think that if folks aren't, I mean, those just seem such wrong. They seem like such wrong numbers.
Right. Okay. So for 750,000 residents, and it's growing by 36 people a day, by the way, there are 36 beds for emergencies. So we have one shelter, which is an emergency shelter. Thrive is transitional housing and resources and services. But for emergencies, there is a waiting list a mile long. They can't help such a great percentage of abused women and children and pets because this has not been made a priority in this state. And it should be, because when you have an epidemic of domestic violence and you are ranking among the top in the number of murders per year, you would think that would then rise to the level of deserving some major attention. And unfortunately, that has not been the case in South Carolina. This keeps getting put on the back burner. It keeps being pushed down. It's a woman's issue, quote unquote. And then, as far as the different charges for domestic violence, there's several levels of domestic violence, but basically it's pretty much up to the judge what the sentence is going to be. So even for criminal domestic violence, where somebody has tried to murder somebody else, the judge really has the option of even putting them on probation. It's not a mandatory time in prison. And then there's the gun control issues, which South Carolina is a gun-loving state. And when a domestic violence household has a gun or guns in the household, the percentages of a murder happening, it goes up. I think it's by 7 times that the woman will then be murdered. And so if a man is arrested and he has guns in his home, and say he's found guilty of criminal domestic violence, the guns are supposed to be removed from his home so that he no longer can possess a gun. Well, that's all good in theory. So I wanted to know, all right, if that's true, who goes and gets the guns out of these criminal domestic violence charged people's homes? So I called the police department, and the police department said, oh, well, you need to call the solicitor's office. That's their deal. So then I called the solicitor's office and I asked them who's the one that goes and gets the guns. Oh, you need to call the police department. That's their department. I cannot get an answer.
Yeah, it's just the runaround.
I'm getting the runaround, and it's so frustrating because this is pretty basic, and it could really save a lot of lives in the long run if we even followed some of the laws that we have. But there are too many ways to get around the charges, and then nobody's going and retrieving the guns. So it's very frustrating.
It seems like it's this massive cycle. So
it is, yeah.
We isolate folks, we don't educate them, we don't have men who step up and say, hey, this needs to be of greater awareness. We create obstacles for people to report. We reduce the trust that anybody would have in the system, that if they do report, they're going to get out of it. So my next part that I want to see if I can focus you guys on, and we want to go into a breakout session about this and have plenty of time for folks to talk about it. What are the solutions in terms of making sure that certainly we've got the resources, but that more people report as well? Because we've got to widen the net to allow more people to report. With 36 beds, I don't know. I mean, you said it, Mackie. You said they can't help. They can't help. So this is what I'm going to, as I put everybody in breakout rooms, this is the question that I want everybody to think about. And that is, what are the necessary parts to the solution? Because this has got to be an obviously multifaceted, holistic approach. But what are the necessary parts of the solution to widen the net in creating an easier path to reporting and to definitively stop the individual abuse from occurring as permanently as possible for everyone? So those are big questions. What I'm going to do is put our participants and panelists into different breakout rooms. So if you've joined us before, you sort of know how this works. There's going to be one person who is not in the breakout room, and that is Duke Haggerty, who's going to talk to us a little bit about something that was something that has already been brought up, and that's guns. And because gun ownership does play a big part in whether or not domestic violence is going to turn into a homicide. So we've got a big issue there. And I got to make sure that I did not put Duke in a room. Sorry about that, Duke. I think I put you in a room, so I got to take you out of that room. Okay, sorry, and I'll put Sydney back in the other one. Okay, I've opened up all the rooms. Duke, I think that you don't have a place. There you go. You're not assigned, so you're going to talk to me. So if you're looking on your screen and you're a participant or a panelist, you should see something that says just join the room right there, and go ahead and do that. So for our Facebook Live audience, one of the reasons that we have these breakout sessions that remain private is because we do really want to prioritize safe spaces. We want to make sure that when these discussions, especially about really emotional issues, take place, that people can do so in a private environment. That's why they're not part of our Facebook Live presentation. But once Duke and I are done talking for a little bit, we'll bring back all the panelists and the participants, and the panelists mainly will share the kinds of things that were spoken about, not with specifics, because that's not exactly what we want. We want to maintain some confidentiality in those private rooms, but we'll talk about some of the solutions that different breakout rooms have come up with. But Duke, as I'm talking to you, and I'm going to ask you to unmute here so that folks can hear about it, hear from you and your perspective. What we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks, and that's October 7th, same time from 7 to 8 p.m., is about guns, people, and justice. And we know from the discussion this evening that simply the context or having a gun be part of the context of an individual raises the probability that a violent act is going to include the gun. So it seems like that needs to be part of the discussion, not just what we do about guns and the people who own them or who use them, but also the balance of that with maintaining rights, maintaining safety and people's constitutional rights and constitutional ideas of safety. That's all got to be part of the landscape. So Duke, what does that landscape really look like? What are the issues and what are maybe the pathways to some solutions as far as safe gun ownership and advocacy are concerned?
All right, well, thank you, Ben. We've been interested in this for a long time, a whole bunch of us, and we've educated ourselves about this. I'm a physician, and we have a group of physicians that regularly meets to educate ourselves about this. And a couple of things come out. Number one, there's a study after study in all parts of the world, particularly the studies are done in Europe, Australia, Israel, and so on. There's a direct correlation between the number of guns and the homicide rates. And also access of guns is also important in the suicide rate. And we're talking about domestic violence now, but suicide is the number one problem with deaths from guns, and it has to do with access. So it goes back to your point. What do we do? Is how do we keep guns safe? All right, if we're going to commit ourselves to the Second Amendment, which we are, and that everyone has a right to have a gun, but it's also that right comes with a responsibility that we need to know how to protect others from harming themselves and to use it appropriately for whatever. So now it comes down to, so there's some basic things that we've advocated for protection. As you know, the number one cause of access to guns in the Charleston community are guns stolen from unlocked cars. That's crazy. Not to mention, you shouldn't have a gun in your car. You should bring it with you. But I have plenty of good friends who've lost guns in their cars, and they know it's wrong, and but it's already done. So we have a lot of guns out there that are floating around, and so that's a simple thing. Then the statistics: if you have a gun in your house, you're 7 times more likely to be shot by your own gun than not. It's just where guns are they're more likely to be a problem. If you take away the access, and that means locking them up properly, and so on, they're very common sense, and making the gun owner responsible for that. That's a huge step. Then we're going to go on to the other access of guns on the internet and buying and so on. We're all familiar with all those discussions, but the one discussion, the one fact that really does make a difference, and it's been shown in the study done in Missouri that allowed that had background checks and then dismissed them, and then at the same time California had developed the background checks. So it was just an inverse relationship, and that was the only difference, was that the institution of background checks. So background checks are really important, and the biggest pushback I get from my friends is that I can't give a gun to my son. Well, if that's the biggest pushback, I'm not that sympathetic. How much trouble is it? It's like wearing a mask. It's like so many other things. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but anyway, it's how hard is this stuff? You can get so, and then so it's infringement rights, but we know from the psychological studies that if you put 10 people in a room and 7 of them had one opinion and 3 of them had another, there's a good chance that one of those 3 people is going to go walking out with the 8th person. I mean, that is part of our DNA, is that when we're in groups, we tend to group think, and that is a fact. And so when we surround ourselves with people who think in these things, and that message is constantly out there, then we're all susceptible to that kind of herd thinking. And what we need is more independent thinking based on science, practicality, and that's the and not this emotional stuff that is so powerful. So I think I've pretty much said enough.
No, that's great. I mean, you talk about group thinking. Is there a possibility? I mean, I believe I looked at, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. I believe I looked at the statistics a couple of years ago, and it was that 88% of South Carolinians support closing the Charleston loophole. It seems like there is a lot of consensus, even if it's not necessarily consensus among legislators, but a lot of consensus where people want to have safer gun laws, where people, especially the gun owners who I know, really preach gun safety and gun sense all the time. They talk to all of their friends constantly about don't leave your gun in your car, always have a lock, about all these different things. Is it possible for us to have a culture where safety is elevated?
Well, the most important thing that's what you're doing right now is talking about it and talking about it in a calm voice and being respectful to listen to the other person to understand their point of view. I've been fortunate enough to grow up in Charleston, and I've actually know a lot of people who live out in Adams Run and that kind of area that are NRA hardcore and who are really good friends. And we talk about this stuff. And then, you know, they have the NRA emblem on their back of their truck, and they've got the AKs and all that stuff. But, you know, so we talk about it, and it's very interesting. They'll say, you know, I'd be glad to give my AK up. I understand all this. And in a lot of ways, I do support background checks. It's a matter, but they're pressured because of peers and so on to have that macho. Goes back to what Mackie was talking about, and you know, and I guess all of it, every male, you and I, white male, I guess there is, you know, there's always a part of everyone, you know, whatever.
Yeah, we're all human beings.
Yes, yeah, it's very difficult being a human
I've got a lot of failures of being. I've got a lot of things, you know, facets of human nature. I mean, literally, the Lord knows I'm far from perfect. And we try and talk about those imperfections and those mistakes that we make real readily throughout our campaign and work we're doing in the community, because it seems like, Duke, it seems like a pathway to having a better, safer world is being able to talk about our own personal failings and inadequacies.
Yeah. Anybody who says they know what the truth is or know what the solution is, run. Run as fast as you can from them. And I don't care, you know, what extreme they're from. I've always found that those people, if we can't have a discussion where we both learn, then that's really not worth the time. But the irony is, as you well know, is that the vast majority of people, one-on-one or two or whatever in smaller groups, are very polite, are interested in the subject, and are once you bring the wall down, there's not a whole lot of difference. They want the same thing that you and I do. They want to be safe in their homes, and some people's ideas of being safe is have a gun in their house so they can protect us. Some of us would say, you know, a gun's more dangerous, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to depend on the police. That kind of stuff. But we all have very similar goals. We want the best for our families and the best for our communities. We have different ways of going there. And the question, just like what you're doing with these discussions, is to get some common ground and go forward.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, you mentioned context, and context is certainly important in that if somebody's, so a couple different thoughts about context. If somebody is prone to violence, or if they're prone to not really being all that diligent about being safe, and within that context, the environmental context, they've got a gun, We know studies have shown that somebody might be more prone to use that gun if they're already prone to violence, which is why it's such a big deal with domestic violence. But in thinking about context a different way, when we're talking about our conversations in the smaller groups, it seems to me, Duke, that when we are in these smaller groups, when we're side by side having conversations about what somebody else's context is like versus what our context is like, we develop a better understanding of where our values overlap. And maybe that is a bigger part of the solution than anything else.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think your point too, I mean, like everyone's conceded, nobody's perfect. And there's a subset out there that's really not perfect. And those need to be dealt with separately. It's the 90% or more that have this common ground, who are looking for common ground. That's where that's where the progress can be made. And it has to do with educating, listening, and being respectful.
Yeah, those common ground, that's sort of what we're trying to do here is develop some common ground as far as our solutions are concerned, not just when it comes to guns and justice and people, but when it comes to other things like domestic violence, understanding where we can have solutions that we get a whole bunch of community support for, so that we can start implementing the policies and actually moving forward. And I'm so glad to be rejoined by so many folks coming in from the breakout rooms. I think we've got almost everybody joining us. I don't see Mackie. Oh, there's Mackie. Okay. Mackie's there, and I think Faith is there too. Great. We really, although we don't point out specifically our panelists, I'm so glad, or our participants, I'm so glad we've had some of the people who are just participants who really enrich the discussion. Mm-hmm. So part of enriching the discussion for the rest of our Facebook Live audience is having our panelists go through a little bit of a few concluding statements about what you've discussed in your rooms, maintaining the confidentiality of the people who shared within them. So Rita, why don't we start with you? What did your room talk about?
Well, I think it was a good discussion, and really, I really enjoyed people sharing thoughts with me. They're smart people. Ben, you got smart people together. So it's really important to think about looking at restorative justice as maybe an option for this kind of process. We can't just always look at the criminal justice system to respond to this. So few communities engage the criminal justice system. Reporting has never been very high for both domestic violence and sexual assault. It's always been very limited in terms of the number of people who actually call and make a report. So it doesn't reflect the damage that's being done to families and communities. So restorative justice prevention is really important. People having options, and then looking at the other influencers like the judges who need to be educated and stay educated, the legislative process that needs to stop watering down bills and making them more palatable and actually put some strength behind them, because it's important for community safety that we do these things. And then, faith leaders being really willing to lead and to challenge this behavior from the perspective of people's belief systems and the principles that they say they adhere to. They need to follow and live their life the way they preach about their principles. And so, and then also schools are an opportunity, I think, to engage and educate people, and not just the teachers, but the kids in the classrooms, and learning different ways and strategies around how they can live a different kind of life if they don't have any other role models to look at. So lots of really great ideas and strategies around how to look at this. But restorative justice was certainly an important one that I think we need to explore and look at, and make sure that survivors know that that's an option to think about.
Yeah, it sounds like more options are better, definitely, and paving the way to reporting is great. And Sharon, you certainly know a lot about that, being able to have people report. So what kinds of things did you guys discuss?
One of the things we talked about is, we mentioned earlier about having the trainings in place. The thing is that you can do all the trainings in the world, but if there's no accountability for them to actually implement the trainings and have someone that they have to report to, that they have to be accountable to, that shows that they're not being biased when they're making these judgments, when they're handing down these sentences. Also getting you in office, getting the right people there to implement the laws, to change the laws, and it's the truth. And we need to push the laws that are already there. Look, if you keep on adding and adding and adding more laws, they just get lost in the middle. You've got to implement what's there, make it important, believe people, be collaborative, but accountability for me is huge. That's the big buzzword for me tonight, is making people accountability worthy and making them do for what they say they're going to do.
That would really be nice. That would really be nice. And Sharon, it sounds like you and Mackie, I want you to take off on this as well. Also sort of discuss the notion that, accountability requires prioritization of domestic violence and abuse and intimate partner violence issues as well.
Yes.
Why don't you go ahead?
Setting that up. We would how dogs, you can go to jail for way longer for hurting a dog than you can a woman. There's way more dog shelters. There are safe houses for domestic violence victims and survivors. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's not the prioritization that we need. Mackie, it's certainly a priority. These solutions are a priority in your life. What did you guys discuss in your room?
Well, we had a great discussion, and it was a really. I had the same experience, Rita. It was just very highly intelligent, responsive, thoughtful people, and part of it is changing the narrative. Instead of why isn't she leaving, why is he abusing? Instead of, the victim is always the one that is for some reason responsible. Why isn't she speaking out? Why isn't she taking better care of the kids? Whatever it may be, there's a lot of victim blaming here. That needs to stop. And there needs, the laws that are in place are not concrete. They are very much up for interpretation, and there's always a way out. It's not specific enough for each offense. It's very vague as to what the punishments are for each criminal domestic violence charge, be it first degree, second degree, third degree, criminal domestic violence. It's not being taken seriously enough in this state. And the other thing that I want to mention is that so often on a first offense, the punishment is for the abuser to go take a class on domestic violence. You got to go for 6 weeks and take this class. And that then gives
anger management. Is that
right? And that gives the victim hope when really there's not hope of rehabilitation at this point. And it's a way of slapping someone on the wrist and then sending them back into the same situation where nothing is going to change, because the percentage of abusers that actually are rehabilitated is incredibly small. And I say this in jest, but it's really kind of true, is that most victims or survivors, need to do the equivalent of joining the witness protection program. It's not about let them take a class and then you can take them back and things are going to change, or he promised he would never do it again. You have to assume that it's going to happen again.
And it's going to be worse.
And it's going to progressively get worse. And that when you get out of a situation, course you're going to miss the person. Of course you love the person. You're going to, it's painful. But what's even more painful is going back into a situation where you think they have been healed, and it's even worse than when you left the situation. It's so huge that that not be a default for domestic violence abusers, that they get to go to a class and then, we'll see what happens. What's next? I mean, what's next is it's going to get worse. And for that to be a sentence for even a second degree, maybe even first degree criminal domestic violence here. Like I said, it's so up for interpretation about the punishments that it's really up to the judge. And
hopefully conversations like this will start to raise all the voices across the entire spectrum, and hopefully, with the work that you're doing, Rita, with the work that you're doing, Sharon, you too, we can elevate the conversation and the importance, whether it's in legislatures, whether it's in private conversations, to really drive solutions. And I can't thank you enough. I wish we could go and talk about this for another hour, but I do want to let folks go. But your presence here is such a big important part of having those solutions within our grasp. So I want to thank our panelists, Sharon, Stefan, Rita Smith, and Mackie Moore, for being here. Please join the conversation online. You can always communicate with us at votebenpogue.com and on our Facebook page. Look up resources like ThriveSC. Look up individuals like Rita Smith and domesticshelters.org to see what you can do and understand what the information is like, what the landscape of this issue is like. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to say good night. And everybody, please join us in 2 weeks when we're talking a little bit more. We'll have Duke Haggerty there, and we look forward to seeing you there. And stay healthy and stay safe.
All right. Good night.
then, good night, everyone.
Good night.